I knew when I got into this research that it wasn't going to be politically popular in a lot of places. I was not prepared for the amount of negative responses that people have had to this stuff. I think it makes us all uncomfortable. It's a very uncomfortable thing to sit in a room with these objects. When you know their names and when you've seen what's happened to them and when you've heard their stories, I think that changes people's perspectives significantly. Since 2008, I've been directing a project called the Undocumented Migration Project, which is a long-term anthropological analysis of border crossings between northern Mexico and southern Arizona. The goal of this project is basically to try to use different anthropological methods, things like archaeology and ethnographic research, to understand this clandestine process. And this project really developed because of my sort of long-term interest in immigration issues, but really it all started out with a conversation I had with someone who I met in central Mexico when I was working on my dissertation. But I felt like there hadn't been much written about these events from a sort of scientific perspective. There had been a lot of stuff written about border crossings, journalists had written about this stuff, or people who had sort of, a couple of days or a couple of weeks of experience looking at this stuff, but just sort of these sort of fantastic tales, and with not a lot of, I thought, sort of historical depth. And I fly down a month later to go look at some of this stuff, and I realized at that point that I could do sort of long-term ethnographic research, collecting the stories of migrants, sort of trying to see what happens to them as they prepare to undertake a border crossing and what happens to them after that. And then I could use archaeology to look at the process itself. Ethically, it's very difficult for me to study it directly, but archaeology has become this way to look at this process sort of indirectly. Things that really struck me about these objects is, and I think for most people they sort of pick up on this first, are the shoes. The shoes are one of the few items of clothing that really retain the shape of the person who actually was wearing it before. So if we look at some of these shoes, it's, I think, pretty easy to imagine the foot and the person who at one point was wearing this stuff. And this is actually one of the first things I ever recovered in southern Arizona. It's a small child's shoe. You can see that there's a hole worn through the bottom sole, and I can't imagine how much of a beating your ankle and your feet take trying to wear something like this that's not intended for long-term hiking. One of the things that we try to do in the field is take back as much as we possibly can. A big concern of mine is that this stuff is getting cleaned up by conservation groups, and for me this is all living history. These are things that we're going to look back on in 50 years and 100 years as, I think, important archaeological sites. They're all labeled and cataloged as we would any normal archaeological assemblage. So they have what we call provenience data, so GPS coordinates, dates, catalog numbers. Everything comes back here to Michigan, and we have students who are working on cataloging the stuff. They'll photograph it, and we're hoping to find homes for this in various museums. For me, my first goal, and I think the most important thing to do with this, is I would like to curate it and then have it be shown first in Mexico. I would like it to go to the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City, because a lot of the people who have gone through this crossing process, these are their stories, and I think it's important for Americans to understand what's going on U.S. soil. But I think it's more important for these migrants to know that there's people out here who do care about their stories, and that trying to give it back to them.